Literally the second I start recording, there's a motorcycle outside. You know, I didn't think I'd be making this video. When I first saw they were making a Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 and 4 remake, my initial thoughts were that it was cool that my favorite game in the series, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3, was getting a remake, but I also found myself feeling skeptical. While 3 was fairly straightforward, 4 was a completely different kettle of fish. I didn't pay it any mind when it came out because I had better things to do at the time. What can I say? This past July, I was sick as a dog. The game kinda came and went without much fanfare. That said, funny story. I went to lend my brother my copy of God of War Ragnarok, only to realize that I'd never actually bought the game physically. I bought the game digitally when it first came out just for expedience's sake, with the assumption that I would buy a physical copy when it goes on sale. Well, my attempt to lend the game out resulted in me remembering that, and I finally picked it up when it went on sale. I also bought a couple of other games for the sake of free shipping. One of them being this game, which was also 30% off, which is peculiar because I thought it had only just come out. Though I don't remember when it came out, which just says it all, doesn't it? All I know is that it was recent. Well, anyways, like I said, I knew very little about it when I first bought it, and it took me not 10 minutes before I realized, wait just a minute, I kinda hate this. Well, that's a bit of a stretch. I don't hate this game, I do however dislike about 50% of it. Let's start with Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3. As a remake of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3, this is pretty good. Even if I'm gonna nitpick it in a minute, this definitely feels like the 6th gen version of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3. It's about as accurate as you could get to the level design, the controls, the physics, it's all there, and it's all what you expect. And it also includes many of the mechanics from the later games as well, which removes the few restrictions from the controls of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3. I previously said that I felt like the controls in that game was the perfect level of complexity where it gave you roughly everything you needed, but didn't overload you. But hey, adding a couple of extra things on top of the available mechanics isn't unwelcome. It's a quality enough remake that brings me right back to when I was a teenager, going through and 100%ing this game front to back with every character. They even maintain some of the jankiness from early PS2 technology, like the weird pre-baked animations that came with certain tasks, or the fact that NPCs didn't move their mouths. They even gave certain cutscenes an attempt at a more retro look, which is certainly a choice. I don't think they quite nailed every level though. There were certain things like how the haunted house in the suburbia level lost a lot of its atmosphere due to certain effects and sounds being missing, but it's not that big of a deal. It is noticeable though. I think this version might be a bit easier, like I remember certain things being a bit of a struggle back in the day, like the rail in Los Angeles, and I found myself being able to basically nail it every single time in this case. And I felt the extra collectibles were a bit overkill. The Iron Galaxy logo collectible in particular is specifically made to be a bit of an obscure pain in the ass to find, and I didn't feel that the rewards it gave you were really worth it. You unlock special secret items in the secret shop, but not much of it is really worth it. Though I found it funny that the two things you can buy from the shop by default are the two secret characters, Bam Margera and Andy Anderson. It's funny, until a little while ago I'd never heard of Andy Anderson, and now he's popping up everywhere. Like, funny story, in one of my recent videos I brought up an anecdote about a time I went to a skateboarding competition hosted by a guy who went by Hippie Mike. This was back when I was a teenager. Somebody mentioned in the comment section, is that the same Hippie Mike that trained Andy Anderson? I looked it up and it turns out, yes it is. Anyways, enough rambling. I don't think there's anything wrong with the remake of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 as far as the content they included. For me, it's all about the content that wasn't included. The thing is, I think the at the time next gen version had a lot going for it, but the at the time previous gen version also had a lot of merit in themselves. Hence why I think it was a mistake to only adapt the content from the 6th gen version. This isn't something that the remake of 1 and 2 had to contend with, because the content was all pretty much universal across all platforms if I recall correctly. But with 3 and 4, different versions have different content. You probably know that this was considered one of the last truly great games of the 5th generation. Matter of fact, it's also the final game to have come out for the N64. And there was an exclusive level in that version. A level that I and many people are attached to. That being the downhill level. That was the first thing I checked when I first got the remake, was to see if downhill was there, and unfortunately it wasn't. Like, sure, the PS1 version doesn't have the cruise ship level that was included here, but it still feels like a bit of a missed opportunity not to include all the content from across generations. make this feel like a truly complete remake. And my question is, why couldn't it have been included? I guess it's hard to articulate why this is important to me without sounding like a bit of an unpleasable consumer. But is it really greedy of me to want something to feel like a complete experience when that's kind of become the standard? I guess that's up to personal interpretation. Good or bad, it's a missed opportunity. And then there's the 5th gen levels generally. I feel like it's a bit of a missed opportunity not to include some of the more unique level design from the 5th gen version, because there were places where I think the 5th gen version had genuinely better level design. Apparently they said they attempted to marry the level design of the 5th and 6th gen versions, but I don't see that, because everything is strictly 6th gen all the time. I think the one exception is in the airport level, which is set at night, like in the PS1 version. Unfortunately, it's not completely vacated like the PS1 version. That was my favorite part of that level, because it gave the whole level a very distinct mood that I really liked. They could have done more in this case to combine the best aspects of the two versions, like how in the 6th gen version of Canada, there's an entire area on the map which is just a big load of nothing, while in the 5th gen version, the entire area has several more structures that make the whole thing far more skatable. Or how in the 5th gen version of Rio de Janeiro, you have this entire secret area behind the main level that you can explore, whereas in the 6th gen version it feels comparatively streamlined. Then there's something like Foundry, where the 5th gen version had these pipes on the walls which could be used to do insane combos, absent in the 6th gen version, and guess which version they use. And then you have, personally, my favorite spot in either version of the game, the 5th gen version of Los Angeles. You can ride an elevator up to a high point and grind this impossibly long elevator back down to ground level. This is the type of spot you can easily add to the 6th gen version layout, because the building with the elevator is there, and the spot it connects to is also there. It would have fit right in there. You see, I'm not expecting them to make two different versions of every level, that would be a bit unreasonable, but there were some things that really should have been included in some way. If they claim to be marrying the different versions of the games, they should have married them better. In fairness, they did include all the levels that were actually in the base game that weren't also remakes from other games. But yeah, the recycled levels were also cut. Warehouse, Burnside, and Roswell. There's nothing stopping them from including these levels in the game, other than the fact that it might disincentivize somebody who hasn't bought the remake of the first two games to buy it. Though it does speak to the cynicism of modern game publishing that something that didn't even matter 20 years ago is now potentially seen as something that could cost you a game sale, even if the content is already made and could easily be put on the disc. But ultimately, it doesn't matter all that much, because the purpose of including the extra levels was specifically because they wanted to update those levels for the new generation at the time, and while the remake of 1 and 2 is a few years old at this point, there's not a generational gap that requires them to be remade in this case. That one looks about as good as this one. There's also the unlockables from the original version of the game that aren't in the remake, such as Darth Maul as a playable character, but considering the labyrinth of copyright law that Star Wars exists in at this point, that's acceptable. Really, the worst thing I can say about the remake of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 is that it could have been better. It feels somewhat bare bones compared to what it should have been, making it feel like a remake born out of love for money and not love for the game they were remaking. And given that this is an Activision game we're talking about, that should surprise absolutely nobody. But for a remake, simply being good enough isn't necessarily good enough. The fact is, when you're making a shot-for-shot remake, you should be aiming to make something better than the original. You should be aiming to add cuts or extra content, new modes, something to make it stand out. You should be aiming to fix aspects of the game design that didn't work instead of recreating it warts and all. Because if you're aiming for something completely 100% accurate instead of something slightly better, the best something could ever be is as good. But it's never going to be as good because there's always going to be little issues that crop up when you're attempting to make a perfect recreation of something. And when you have something as a point of comparison, it's very easy to point out where one thing got something right and another thing got it wrong. This is a remake that's almost perfect for the content that's included, but it has enough wrong with it that it's worth slightly less than the game it's recreating. But that's just me. If all you want is the ability to re-experience the game as you remember it, it's a decent game as far as re-experiencing the game. The remake of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4, meanwhile, is a dumpster fire of a remake, if you ask me. You see, what is the essence of a remake? If you're looking at a shot-for-shot remake, then the idea is to have something that creates the exact same or as close to the exact same experience as the original that you can get away with. But for some reason, the remake of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4 is such a different experience that it might as well be a completely different game altogether. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. The pink elephant in the room, if you will. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4 is a very different game to the first three, and that's because it eschews the 2-minute timer. However, in a move that was as bold as it was lazy, they put the 2-minute timer back in the remake. Here's the thing, I'm the guy who's gone on record as saying that I think the games got less fun when you eliminated the 2-minute timer, because that's the thing the series' identity was built off of, and it was a unique element that added a lot to the games. It meant that each run was short, but not so short that you couldn't get a lot done. It meant the entire experience felt very snacky and fast-paced. It built into the arcadey nature of the game's precise, skill-based gameplay. It meant that it had to be creative with the goals, making them difficult but theoretically quick. It gave the game an inbuilt speedrunning feature in the sense that the most fun you can get with these games is seeing how many goals you can stack on top of each other in one round. There was even one time when I was 16 playing Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 on PS2 and somehow managed to get every single goal in the Foundry level in one go. I took a picture of it at the time, but that picture was on a phone that has since been trashed. With that said, I fully acknowledge that the series needed to move on from the timer at some point because as fun and unique as the 2-minute timer was, it was restrictive. It meant that you could only have levels of a certain size, you could only have goals of a certain complexity, and the game could only be built a certain way. It's something that would probably get repetitive, and we probably already saw the best of what the system had to offer by the time the third game came around. You theoretically want developers to have the freedom to build a game however they wish. And by eliminating the 2-minute timer, what you lose in unique identity, you gain in design freedom tenfold. And that's the greatest strength of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4. By breaking away from what the first three games did, it had the freedom to do what it wanted, and the game built an entirely new experience with that in mind. A campaign with tasks that you could activate one at a time, and said tasks would gradually get more and more ridiculous as the levels went on, right up to the point when you unlocked a second set of pro challenges which were even harder, culminating with the final challenge of every pro. Say what you will about the style of gameplay, and I certainly have, but it was deliberate and everything about the game built into that design. It allowed them to build much more grand and elaborate levels, many of which you wouldn't be able to explore in 2 minutes, let alone do a series of tasks. And they intuitively built the game so that you weren't supposed to get every single task in a level the first time around. As you did more tasks, you got more stats, and therefore you cycled through the simple tasks to build your way up to the harder tasks, and some of these tasks required you to really get in touch with the level design. There were some tasks that required you to know all the level design and all the secrets front to back. All that to say, it wasn't optimized for the timer style of gameplay, and the proof is in the pudding. The level design clashes with the timer, and as a result, if the timer is set to 2 minutes, it could take several tries before you accomplish one task because there's simply not enough time. Like in Alcatraz, where you have to find 5 garbage cans. The Alcatraz level is huge, and exploring the level itself once around could take more than 2 minutes, let alone trying to find specific things. And that's not even to mention the competition levels. In this case, they only give you 1 minute, and in fairness, the only level they bring over from the original that they make into a competition level is the Kona level, but Kona is among the biggest levels in the game. It's to the point where they give you a different spawn location for every round because they know there's no possible way for you to see everything in a single 1-minute run. It's simply unreasonable. And you know, for what it's worth, you have the ability to extend the 2-minute timer to up to an hour. Yeah, that's not a feature, that's just proof positive that this was a poor decision. If you have to extend the timers like this, then the levels aren't built for the gameplay style you're trying to force them into. Sadly, I found the only way to make the Pro Skater 4 levels playable was to extend the timer to 5 minutes. It's kind of a rock and a hard place situation. As sacrilegious as this feels, it's kind of the only way if you ask me. And here's the thing, I can't tell if this was done in order to give the remake of 4 parity with the other remakes, or if this was done solely so they could laze out and not have to do the full remake of the original campaign, because it was a quite elaborate campaign with plenty of voice acting and plenty of unique animations. But by taking some of those tasks and implementing them into the level like this, it means you can cut down on the presentation and production value by quite a bit. Good or bad, this does not make for an accurate remake, and the omitted aspect of the campaign makes the whole thing feel substantially more lazy. And for me, it's not even necessarily the timer itself making the game a less enjoyable experience, although that is definitely the case. For me, it's the principle of the thing. Even if they focus tested every single level to hell and back and gave them each a timer that was perfectly optimized for that specific level, it still wouldn't matter because that's ultimately not what I don't like about this. To me, this is insulting because they actively went out of their way to put all these things together to make a game where the experience was completely unlike the game that was being remade. It's insulting to the fans to even call this a remake because it's blatantly not. Like, yeah, all the level design is there, although they made some changes, and they fairly accurately recreate some of the tasks that you would have done in Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4 originally, but the entire fundamental experience is completely different. And even saying that all the level design is there is a bit misleading, because even once you get past the disrespect to the original structure, there's also the cut content. Oh boy, the cut content. Unlike Pro Skater 3, you have levels from both Gen 5 and Gen 6 that are cut. Bafflingly, the levels that were cut from the Gen 6 version included Chicago, the Carnival, and the practice level. Guys, that's 3 out of 10 levels not included. And okay, the practice level is barely a level, but even if you omit that, that's 2 out of 9 levels not included. More than a fifth of the game doesn't exist in the remake. I guess with Chicago, it is a level that was from one of the Matt Hoffman games, but so what? Have you ever heard of the term legally distinct? Sure, it's a level from a copywritten game, and I'm not sure how different it had to be for that not to be the case. But I don't imagine you would have to do much work to change it just enough to make it recognizable for what it is, while also not stepping into any copyright potholes. But even then, can you really copyright level design? I don't know. But either way, it's omitted, and that's the bottom line. But the most baffling omission was Carnival. It wasn't the greatest level of all time, but it was pretty important in that it was one of the 2 bonus levels you could buy. In place of both these levels, you have first of all Movie Studio, then Water Park, which is actually the level on the splash screen page of the game, so it was probably the thing they were hoping would sell the experience more than any. And then the final bonus level is called Pinball. I'm not against them making original levels, and in fairness, these levels are actually pretty good, but in that case, make an original game. Was this a compromise? Did Iron Galaxy want to make an original game and this was Activision compromising? Whatever the case, they still cut a third of the game. The fact that they didn't include the PS1 exclusive levels almost seems petty by contrast, but it's still worth remarking on in that case as well. For the same reasons as I would have liked them to include Downhill, they should have included these levels as well. Those levels being Little Big World and the sewers. It's another thing that makes the game feel like a half-assed remake on top of all the other things that make it feel like a half-assed remake. So this is a game that's missing a good chunk of its content, and structurally speaking, it's a completely different game from the original version. Like I said before, what is the basis of what a remake is? What does it mean to be a shot-for-shot remake? Well, it's something that gives you the essential experience of something that already exists, updated with modern technology, and in that respect, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4 completely fails. Because it's not a remake, it's a completely different game. Different levels, different structure. It's the Ship of Theseus of video games. I'm not saying a remake can't or shouldn't mix things up. As a matter of fact, I think they should. For example, this game does something really cool wherein if you complete all the goals in both Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 and 4, you get a second set of much harder pro goals. In fact, this is how they reintroduce some of the more famous tasks from the story mode of Pro Skater 4, like the Pink Elephant mission. I specifically remember that Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2X does something similar. For those of you who don't remember, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2X was a remake of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 for the original Xbox. Once you completed all the tasks in the main game, you unlocked a second campaign which is made up of a couple of original levels. And then after that, you unlock a third campaign, which is the campaign from the first game also remade. That's the best thing a remake can do. Have the base experience, but then add a bunch of stuff on top of that to complement the main experience. But the fact is, this game doesn't capture the experience of the original game, and so having extra stuff on top of that feels like a waste instead of a bonus. God help them if they pull this with the Underground games. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4 isn't exactly the most popular game in the series. So that's probably why I didn't hear much about this game, but the Underground games, especially the first Underground game, are easily the most beloved games in the series outside of Pro Skater 2 and maybe 1. And you do not mess with Underground fans. I know because I've gone on record in saying that I'm not the biggest fan of the Underground games, and let's just say people voiced their displeasure on the topic. Don't take any of this to assume that I hate this bundle of remakes, because I feel like they nailed the engine as far as a modern version of the old school Tony Hawk's Pro Skater games, and the moment-to-moment gameplay in both these games is still as good as it ever was, and that's why I will say that this is a good game. It is, however, a complete failure of a remake. Because what makes a good game and what makes a good remake are two completely separate things. So ultimately, I feel like this is a game that fails at what it sets out to do despite its positive qualities. Here's hoping they do better next time. That's all I've got. If you like this video and want to support the channel, you can leave a like, comment telling me what you think, subscribe, and hit the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Stay crispy, my friends.